Welcome to the night the whip broke silence. The night a man once called property refused to kneel. It happened deep in the sugar lands of St. James Parish, Louisiana. 1859. The air was heavy with molasses and ash. The fields glowed under a sickle moon, their white rows of cane shimmering like ghosts of the enslaved who never came home. And somewhere near the overseer's quarters, a shout tore through the humid dark. "Down on your knees, boy." But he didn't. He stood. His name, half erased in the plantation ledger, was believed to be Samuel Carter. 26 years old, born on the very land that chained him. In the records, he was listed as Negro male, 5'10" strong back, silent disposition. But the silence ended that night, because when the overseer's lash came down, Samuel didn't lower his head. He caught it with his bare hands. Witnesses later swore they saw sparks, though maybe it was just moonlight against the metal hook of the whip, or maybe something else. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from, and the exact time you're listening. Because somewhere even now, someone is hearing this story for the first time. The sound of defiance carried through more than a century of silence. Louisiana, 1859. On the eve of war, but still years before the word freedom would cross these fields. The sugar empire stretched for miles, run by men who spoke of order and obedience, while the cries of the enslaved drifted through the cypress. To defy even a command, even a gesture, was to gamble with life itself. Yet Samuel refused. The overseer Jacob Durrell was known for making examples. His journal, found decades later in a collapsed storehouse, recorded only one line for that night. One refused, punishment delivered. No body was ever recorded. No burial noted. No transfer logged. Only whispers that something changed. After that night, the dogs wouldn't cross the cane line, and the master's son claimed he heard singing from the fields long after midnight, a voice that shouldn't have been there. Picture it. The cane fields before dawn, the air thick with humidity and fear. A single lantern sways by the overseer's shack. Chains rattle in rhythm with the night insects. Inside the cabin, other enslaved workers hold their breath, afraid even to whisper his name. To speak, it was dangerous, but to forget, it was worse. One of them, a young boy named Elijah, whose testimony appears in the 1936 WPA slave narrative collection, remembered the moment. He ain't bend. He looked the man straight in the face, and all the dogs start howling. We knowed then something was coming, something they couldn't whip away. That night the punishment yard fell silent. The whip cracked once, then again, then nothing. The overseer ran for the main house, his lantern swinging wild. And from the far edge of the field, voices rose, not screams, but a humming, low, deep like thunder under the earth. The melody matched no known spiritual from the time. No lyrics survived. But old field songs collected in St. James Parish echo the same rhythm, 3 beats a pause and a long rising hum. Some called it the sound of standing. Centuries later, historians found no proof of a man named Samuel Carter buried on that plantation. Yet on a faded wall of the old sugar mill, beneath layers of soot, someone had carved words that barely remained. "I will not kneel." And perhaps that's all that needs to be said. Because in a world where obedience was survival, defiance was resurrection. The story you're about to hear is not written in marble or taught in schools. It lives in fragments, a missing ledger, a burned cabin, a whispered hymn. But tonight, you'll walk those fields again. You'll feel the ash in the air, the tension in every step, the pulse of a man who dared to stand when the world demanded he bow. This is not just one man's rebellion, it's the echo of countless who refused, unseen, unnamed. And as the first light creeps over the cane, you'll realize something: the story never really ended. Because every generation finds its own way to stand when history tries to make them kneel. Louisiana, 1859. A land that shimmered with gold but bled with silence. They called it the Sweet Kingdom, a place where sugarcane waved like oceans under the southern sun. But beneath those green blades lay bones. Bones of men, women, and children who had fed that empire for generations. The Mississippi flowed just beyond the fields, slow-wide and cruelly calm, carrying ships loaded with molasses, rum, and the unseen weight of human suffering. Every dawn began the same. The conch shell horn blew before the first light touched the swamp fog. The sound rolled through the rows of cane like a ghost calling its kin. And bodies began to move, bare feet on cold mud, wooden spoons scraping empty bowls, the hiss of dew meeting skin already scarred. The year was 1859, 1 year before the storm of war. But the violence was already here. It just didn't have uniforms yet. On the Durrell plantation 20 miles upriver from New Orleans, the overseer's whistle was law. Jacob Durrell, son of a French Creole merchant, had inherited both his father's land and his father's appetite for control. He wasn't born cruel. The land made him that way. The endless pressure of debt, the fear of losing labor, the paranoia that every whisper among the enslaved was the start of an uprising. And so cruelty became his language. The records list 147 enslaved people on that property, to men, 49 women, 45 children. No names in most cases, just numbers, ages, and trade: field hand, boiler, carpenter, nurse, wet nurse, cook. Among them, Samuel Carter. Born 1833. No recorded parents. Baptized without consent by the plantation chaplain. A man who believed salvation could coexist with chains. Samuel was known for his silence until the night he broke it. The fields stretched to the horizon, divided by narrow canals that glistened with the reflection of fireflies. On nights with no wind, the humidity clung so thick you could taste metal in the air. The smell of sugar was everywhere, sweet, then bitter, then suffocating. Inside the refinery, the great kettles boiled without pause. Molasses bubbled like tar. Men worked shirtless in the heat, their skins slick with sweat and ash. Every motion was choreographed: shovel pour, stir, cool. Overseers watched from catwalks above their shadows, cutting across the steam like vultures circling carrion. And yet, within that rhythm of oppression, there were small rebellions, hidden gestures, a whispered prayer before dawn, a song hummed low enough to avoid notice, a glance exchanged that said, "I remember who you are." Those songs, collected decades later in the Library of Congress recordings, carried fragments of those days. One refrain stood out, repeated again and again. "He won't bend his knee, Lord. He won't bend his knee." The voice on the recording belonged to a woman named Ada May, descendant of an enslaved worker from St. James Parish. Her tone cracked when she spoke of the story behind it. "My grandmama say once there was a man who stood. They beat him, but the land remembered. The land remembered. Louisiana remembers everything. The soil here is heavy with memory, black, rich, but soaked with centuries of labor. When it rains, the scent rises like breath from the past." Archaeologists in the 1970s found shack remains just beyond the levee-charred timber, rusted shackles fused to the wood. They dated the burn to late 1859. Local legends called it the Night of Smoke. Some said it was lightning, others said it was vengeance. But in the Parish folklore, it was the land itself that rebelled. Still, life continued as if nothing happened, because it had to. Sunrise meant the same ritual. Overseer on horseback, ledger in hand. Row 20 faster. You watch the boiler. You stop that singing. The crack of the whip was punctuation. The screams were part of the grammar of the plantation. Yet there was another world just beyond the cane line. Hidden huts where elders whispered to children about Africa, about rivers that flowed backward, about spirits that traveled through drums. Those stories weren't rebellion, they were survival. Memory disguised as myth. Sometimes at night, the enslaved gathered by the bayou under the guise of prayer, but in the rhythm of the drums and the stamping of feet, there was something more ancient. something that predated Louisiana, predated chains. In the hush between beats, the name Samuel still traveled past from lip to lip like a forbidden hymn. A freedman interviewed in 1938. Joseph Papa Joe Clemens said this about those nights. We ain't call it worship, we call it remembering. The Lord hear us, but so do the dead. In the distance, plantation bells marked hours like prison chimes. Midnight meant curfew. 2 a.m. meant the watch patrol changed. But somewhere in that deep night, if you stood still enough, you could hear it, the low hum rolling across the fields. Not wind, not animals. A vibration human and heavy, like hundreds breathing in unison. That sound terrified men like Durrell, because he couldn't name it. And anything unnamed was uncontrollable. The machinery of slavery depended on silence, on obedience. But sound was their weapon. Every song, every chant, every footstep in rhythm was a map, an invisible rebellion. And that's where the legend of Samuel Carter begins to fuse with history. In plantation ledgers, he disappears after November 1859. In oral traditions, he never disappeared at all. The people say he became part of the land, his spirit standing in every row of cane that dared to grow after his death. They say when thunder hits the fields at night, it's him, the man who refused to kneel, walking again through the smoke. Fact or folklore, it doesn't matter. Because what's undeniable is the pattern. After 1859, the Durrell plantation's yield dropped by nearly half. Sugar exports faltered. The overseer quit. The master sold the land. And within 3 years, war arrived. Louisiana burned from within long before Union troops came. The ghosts had already started their march. So when we speak of one man refusing to kneel, we're not just telling a story. We're tracing the first crack in an empire built on silence. And that crack, once opened, never truly closed. History begins where ink dries, but on this land the ink bled away. After the night, Samuel Carter refused to kneel. The plantation ledger was altered. The next week's entries were neat, ordered, precise, except for one blank space. One missing line, one number skipped. The bookkeeper's quill scratched it out as if silence could make a man vanish. In the courthouse at St. James Parish, the record of that plantation still exists. Pages eaten by humidity, the handwriting fading like breath on glass. In the November accounts of 1859, a single annotation appears. Inventory adjusted for loss. Laborer unaccounted for. Resolved. No mention of cause, no burial record, no sale receipt. Only that chilling word, resolved. But nothing was resolved. Because while the official records erased him, the people who lived beneath those same roofs remembered. Not in paper. In whispers, in song, in fear. A century later, the WPA interviewers came. Traveling by mule cart and steamboat, they recorded the last living witnesses, the old voices who carried memory like contraband. One of them, Elijah Turner, 83 years old at the time, spoke of a man who stood tall when the lash came down. They try not to say his name in front of white folks, Elijah whispered. But we know. He's the one that made the cane grow different. After he gone, the sugar tastes like tears. Another interview from Ada Mae Robichaux carried the same tremor. Mama say the fields still hum at night. You go out there, you hear it. Sound like breath coming up from the ground. Those recordings now sit in the Library of Congress, fragile acetate discs, labeled St. James 1937, Plantation Tales. But listen closely between the static, and you'll hear it, the faint sound of someone humming behind the words. A woman's voice, low, deliberate, repeating 3 beats, and then silence. That rhythm matches another fragment found not in sound, but in script. In the Louisiana Historical Society archives lies a torn newspaper clipping from the Daily Delta, dated December 1859. Fire reported at sugar works near St. James. Possible sabotage suspected. Overseer's statement incomplete. No arrests made. No name. No investigation. Just smoke, lost, silence. Yet in the oral traditions collected from black churches in the same region, the story changes form. They say a man was beaten for defiance, but the whip broke. They say his chains melted like wax. They say when he fell the ground itself trembled, and the mill caught flame. The preacher who told that story never mentioned Samuel Carter. He called him the Standing One. That's the space where history and folklore meet, where absence becomes presence. The plantation account books record loss of property. The people record the birth of legend. Between those two worlds lies the truth too vast for ink, too dangerous for paper. In the 1870 census, the name Carter reappears attached to a freed family of 3 living near the same parish. The oldest member listed as unknown male, 40 to 45 years occupation cane cutter. Coincidence, maybe. But the ages fit. The location fits. When a historian from Tulane University tried to trace them, she found their descendants still carried an old family hymn. Its lyrics, half English, half Gullah, went, "He stand when the world say bow. He stand when the fire come down." The melody 3 beats. A pause, then a rise. Folklore has always been the second archive of the enslaved. When written history deletes folklore, rewrites. In some versions, Samuel didn't die that night. He walked into the swamp, never seen again. In others, he was buried under the cane row that turned black after rain. In one haunting tale, the slaves claimed they saw him weeks later, standing by the levee, staring at the plantation lights. The dogs didn't bark. The overseer's horse refused to cross. When the old people told this, they never said ghost. They said the land kept him. There's a phrase common in those Louisiana narratives. The ground knows. It meant that whatever truth human hands tried to bury the earth would someday speak it back. And in that belief, Samuel Carter was never gone, just waiting for someone to listen. But official voices told a different story. In 1860, the New Orleans Picayune ran a small column on Negro unrest upriver. It blamed foreign abolitionist influence, dismissed rumors of superstitious fears among slaves, and assured readers that discipline has been restored. 2 months later, the Durrell family sold half their property and moved east. Within a year, the Civil War began. The line between folklore and fact blurred completely, because by then the people didn't need proof, they had memory. And memory in that time was rebellion. Every time the name Samuel was spoken in the hush of prayer, it wasn't myth, it was code. A reminder, a spark, a warning whispered across generations. There was a man who stood, and for a moment the whip failed. In 1890, a traveling preacher named Reverend Lewis Green wrote a sermon titled "The Man Who Would Not Bow." It was printed in a small black-owned press in Baton Rouge. He wrote, "When they burned his body, they did not know they were lighting a torch that would never go out." The torch in that sense became spiritual, because by the early 20th century, the same rhythm, 3 beats and a pause, surfaced in early gospel recordings. It appears in "Standin' on the Promised Ground," 1921, and later in field chants used during the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Different words, different battles, same heartbeat. No historian can prove Samuel Carter existed, not completely. But the silences around his absence are louder than any record. Every missing name on a plantation log is a monument. Every unmarked grave is a library. And every whispered hymn that survived 150 years is evidence enough. Fact layer. I gives us fragments erased, ledgers burned, mills, censored newspapers. Folklore layer. I gives us what the facts can't. The pulse, the smell of the fields, the sound of a man's breath turning into a song. Together they form a truth deeper than proof, because history writes for the victors, but folklore remembers the fallen. And in the story of Samuel Carter, in every voice that dared to hum his song, both layers survive. One seen, one felt. The story didn't end with Samuel Carter's defiance. It spread slow at first, like a rumor caught in the wind between the cane rows, then faster, carried by voices that refused to die. In the months that followed his disappearance, strange things began to happen across the lower plantations of St. James Parish. Overseers spoke in hushed tones. Ledger entries grew cautious. The dogs, once trained to tear flesh on command, began to howl through the night, refusing to cross certain fields. Workers whispered that the ground had turned restless. The sugar cane grew taller than before, but brittle, snapping at the slightest touch. The mills that had once thundered with fire and iron started to fail. Boilers cracked without cause. The sweet smell of boiling syrup mixed with something else, the acrid tang of smoke that came from nowhere. They called it the season of burning, defy. The first disappearance came in December 1859. A man named Isaac, known to be one of the strongest field hands, simply vanished. No one saw him leave. No tracks were found. His shack stood untouched, his bowl still half full of cold grits, his shirt folded by the cot. The overseer wrote in his report, "Runaway presumed. Recovery impossible." But the other workers said otherwise. They claimed Isaac had gone into the fields at dusk, drawn by the sound of humming low and far away, and never came back. Days later, the overseer's horse was found dead in the same row. No wounds, just eyes open, mouth full of ash. January brought another omen. The cane press exploded before sunrise, sending molten sugar and iron shrapnel through the refinery. 2 white laborers died instantly. 3 enslaved men burned beyond recognition. The local paper called it an industrial accident. But among the enslaved, a new phrase spread: "The fields are remembering." And then came the night when the whip went silent. A patrol of overseers rode out past midnight to inspect the outer quarters. They carried torches and rifles, drunk on fear and whiskey. By dawn, none returned. Their horses wandered back alone, reins dragging, eyes wild. One of the animals bore deep lash marks, but on its neck, not its back, as if struck by invisible hands. That morning, the Durrell plantation shut down operations. No conch horn, no overseer's whistle. The white owners gathered at the main house, pale, whispering of curses and revolt. But no uprising came. The enslaved didn't move. They just stood in the fields, waiting. In 1937, one of the last surviving witnesses, Martha Bell, told a WPA interviewer, "That night, the sky turned red like the Lord set it on fire. We hear singing far off low. It ain't like church. It sound like the ground singing back." She said they saw something in the distance, a line of light moving slow through the mist. At first they thought it was lanterns, but the lights didn't sway like fire. They floated. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through the cane in perfect silence. No record confirms it. No photo, no letter. Just voices trembling across time, repeating the same image again and again. A field alive with ghostly light. By February, panic gripped the parish. Rumors reached New Orleans. Slave patrols doubled. Night watches were posted at every crossing. The governor's office issued a circular warning of unsettling disturbances among the Negro population upriver. But in the official reports, no names, no suspects, only incidents without evidence. Meanwhile, the local churches filled with prayers of protection. Ministers preached against the darkness that walks among the cane. And yet even those ministers confessed strange dreams. One wrote in his journal, "I see the field in flame, and in it a man stands unburned." Then, folklore scholars later traced those dreams as part of a wider pattern, stories told from one plantation to the next. A woman in Ascension Parish swore she saw a tall figure at the levee's shoulders, glistening like wet iron, singing in a tongue she didn't know. A child in Plaquemine said he saw a man with no face walking beside the river, his shadow longer than the night. Each tale pointed back upriver to the Durrell land. Some said Samuel had returned. Others said the land itself had taken shape, that the spirit of every man and woman broken on that soil had fused into one. Fact and myth began to blur until even the overseers believed. One surviving letter from a sugar broker in Baton Rouge, dated March 1860, reads, "The planters are in disarray. The Negroes are quiet, but there is something in their stillness that terrifies me more than rebellion." And that's what truly spread, not uprising, but quiet, a silence heavier than thunder. because the enslaved had learned that silence could kill faster than sound. Weeks passed. Then one final fire. It began in the boiler house, but the wind carried it fast. Flames leapt from cane to cane, green stalks hissing like serpents. Witnesses said the air itself shimmered. The overseer Jacob Durrell was last seen running toward the mill, shouting orders no one followed. By morning, the entire plantation was ash. The newspapers blamed negligence. Insurance records listed it as act of God. But in the neighboring plantations, people said they heard singing as the flames spread, that same three-beat rhythm, the same rise and pause that had haunted every story since. They said the man who refused to kneel had come to collect what was owed. After the fire, the parish was never the same. Families were sold off lands, divided names scattered across ledgers like ash on wind. But the legend didn't fade, it multiplied. A freedman from the 1870s, quoted in a Reconstruction-era newspaper, said, "Every field that burned, we said his name. We say he walk again." In the white folks, they get quiet. The fear that once belonged to the enslaved had changed sides. And by the time Union troops marched through Louisiana in 1862, they found those same fields deserted. Not one overseer remained. The locals whispered that the land had gone barren, that nothing would grow where blood had soaked too deep. In the decades that followed, historians tried to explain it. Faulty boilers, poor labor conditions, racial paranoia. But none could account for how a single man's defiance, one refusal in the dark, rippled through an entire region. Because it wasn't just Samuel's act. It was the echo of 1,000 unseen rebellions. Every broken chain, every whispered prayer, every stare held too long in the face of cruelty. Those weren't accidents, those were signals, and maybe that's why the whip went silent. Because in that moment, when one man refused, something shifted in the air. The sound of submission fractured. The empire trembled even if it didn't yet know it. The fire wasn't just destruction. It was revelation. The truth beneath the sugar exposed. And what rose from the ashes wasn't just smoke. It was memory alive, unextinguished. By the time the smoke cleared over St. James Parish, the South was already breaking apart. The year turned 1860, bled into 1861, and Louisiana's sugar empire stood on the edge of collapse. But long before cannons roared at Fort Sumter, the rebellion had already begun, in whispers. They said the cane no longer grew right. That after the Great Fire, the soil turned black and sour, and when it rained, the water ran red for days. No crop inspector could explain it. No overseer dared replant. And so acre after acre was left fallow, a scar on the land that refused to heal. In the Parish records, planters called it the Blight of 60. In the folklore of the freed people, it was known by another name, the Mark of the Standing Man. When Union troops finally reached those fields 2 years later, they found ruins. The chimneys of the old mill stood like gravestones, and the ground was scattered with rusted chains. An officer's report dated April 1862 reads, "The site appears abandoned long before our arrival. Local Negroes speak of a man burned alive who now walks the field in storms. They cross themselves when they say it." His words, meant to sound rational, trembled at the edges, as though he'd heard the singing himself. Other soldiers wrote home about it too. Letters from the 7th Illinois Infantry describe strange lights on the cane fields and music like moaning, carried by the wind. The stories were dismissed as nerves, but they kept writing them. One even claimed that while digging trenches near the levee, his men unearthed a chain fused into stone. Science couldn't explain that either. The Freedmen's Bureau arrived next, trying to rebuild order in a land where the law had always been cruelty. Agents cataloged burned plantations, listed freed laborers, and recorded testimonies from those who'd stayed. In one of those fragile reports preserved in the National Archives, a freed woman named Hester Jones testified, "We don't go in them fields after dark. He out there, the one they beat. He looked like smoke, but he walked like man. When thunder come, he hummed that song. The bureau clerk, perhaps uneasy, added his own note in pencil. Superstition of locals persistent. But the locals weren't superstitious. They were remembering. Because for them, the story of Samuel Carter wasn't a haunting. It was proof. Proof that resistance had meaning. That the earth itself took sides. As Reconstruction dawned, new generations of freed people reclaimed that legend. They told it in praise houses and secret gatherings. In the dim light of kerosene lamps, elders spoke of the standing man who refused the lash. They said he became the guardian of the forgotten, the spirit who walked beside the oppressed, unseen but never gone. Every storm season when lightning struck the riverbank, children were warned, "That's him walking." And when a man stood up to a master, even after freedom came, they'd whisper, "He got Carter's heart." What began as terror for one man's defiance became a myth of endurance. Historians, of course, looked for explanations. Some said the tale was born from trauma, a collective memory shaping itself into ghost story. Others believed it was coded resistance, a way to preserve forbidden history through parable. But there are details that keep defying reason. In 1894, a farmer plowing near the old Durrell tract uncovered a rusted shackle engraved with faint letters SC. In 1901, a small church built near the site collapsed after a storm. The only thing left standing was its wooden cross, charred black and humming faintly when the wind passed through the hollow. Coincidence, maybe, or maybe not. Because the same year, a gospel hymn appeared in a traveling revival in Baton Rouge. Its chorus went, "He stand when fire fall down. He stand when thunder call round. He stand till chains unbound." No one knew who wrote it. No composer ever claimed it. But its rhythm, 3 beats a pause, a rise, matched the pattern of that old plantation song. The one that began with Samuel Carter. By the early 1900s, folklore collectors recorded more versions. In one, he became a saint, Saint Carter of the Cane. In another, he was neither man nor spirit, but a wind that carried voices of the dead to the living. A woman interviewed in 1925 said, "My mama say if you kneel to pray, you better mean it, else he come stand behind you. The Lord hear true hearts only." It wasn't fear, it was reverence. The myth had grown into a moral compass, a code of dignity. Never kneel for cruelty, and that idea would echo long after the last plantation fell silent. When the Great Migration began, and trains carried thousands of black families northward, many carried the legend with them. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Harlem, sermons still told of a man who stood when others bowed. In the jazz clubs of the 1920s, the rhythm reappeared syncopated, subtle, but there. Musicians called it the field step. 3 beats and a breath. It became a pattern of resistance, hidden in rhythm, an unspoken heritage. Meanwhile, scholars from Howard University in the 1930s began tracing those songs. One Dr. Frances Adair visited the ruins of the Durrell plantation. In her notes she wrote, "The air here hums even when it's still. Locals say it's wind, but my recorder picks a tone below human hearing 30 hertz. It vibrates through the soil. I felt it in my ribs." She was dismissed by her peers as imaginative, but she never recanted what she felt. By mid-century, the standing man entered literature. Poets used his name in metaphors of protest. Civil rights preachers invoked his defiance in sermons. And when marchers faced dogs and fire hoses in the streets of Birmingham, they sang a variation of that same hymn, "We Shall Not Be Moved." Different words, same heartbeat, the rhythm of standing. It's strange how a man erased by history could leave behind a pulse that refuses to stop. Folklore layer 2 deepens what fact layer 2 cannot. Officially, there's still no grave, no certificate, no proof he lived. Yet the records of absence are proof enough, proof of fear, of silence, of something officials couldn't name. What folklore gave him was immortality. What history gave him was erasure. And between those two, the truth breathes. Because when a story refuses to die, When it passes from generation to generation, reshaping itself to every new struggle, it becomes something larger than fact. It becomes cultural memory. And cultural memory is stronger than chains. Even now in St. James Parish, the locals say that when storms roll across the river and lightning strikes the sugar fields, you can hear a hum rising through the cane. Not wind, not thunder. A man's voice, steady, unbroken, singing the oldest vow on this land. I will not kneel. Time has a way of folding back on itself. And in Louisiana, the past never really sleeps. It just hums under the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. By the mid-20th century, the Durrell plantation was gone. Its land divided, its history paved over by progress. A highway cut through what used to be the cane rows, and a refinery rose nearby, sterile, metallic, modern. But if you walked past the last mile of gravel down to where the bayou curls like a scar, you'd still feel it. The air thickens. The light changes. The birds grow quiet. That's where the Standing Man's story found its way back, not through faith, not through song, but through the records no one was meant to find. In 1958, a historian named Dr. Evelyn Moore from Tulane University began researching minor slave uprisings in the lower Mississippi Valley. Her early reports were ordinary lists of plantation economies, census data, old trade routes. But one letter changed everything. It came from an archivist in Baton Rouge who had stumbled upon a trunk of burned papers discovered in a collapsed courthouse basement. The folder bore a faint charred title, Durrell, 1859, Property Loss and Disciplinary Records. Inside were only fragments. The first page blackened to the edges, the ink smeared by water. But the words that survived read, refused command. Others watched. He spoke no word. Flames rose by themselves. Another sheet held a list of confiscated items. One chain broken, one whip, steel-tipped melted at handle, one brass cross scorched beyond repair. And at the bottom, scrawled in a different hand, almost frantic. The field sang. No signature, no explanation. Just that line vibrating through a century of silence. Dr. Moore didn't know what to make of it. She filed the papers, labeled them unverified folklore, and moved on. But the words stayed with her. Years later, she returned not as a historian, but as a seeker. She visited St. James Parish in the summer of 1967, the year when America itself was shaking, the year of riots, marches, and voices demanding to stand. She drove along Highway 18 until the road ended, then followed a dirt path through overgrown cane. Locals had warned her not to go alone. She went anyway. What she found wasn't a plantation, it was a wound. A low field overrun with wild grass, the air heavy with humidity, and something older, the smell of iron, like rust and rain, mixed together. At the center stood a single brick chimney, leaning its surface burned black. Vines crawled up its side, twisting like veins. Dr. Moore unpacked her recorder. She noted temperature, wind soil, all standard procedure. Then, at 3:17 p.m., her tape captured something unexpected. A faint vibration, low and rhythmic. 3 pulses. A pause. A rise. She checked the mic. No interference, no nearby machinery, just the sound. The transcript of that tape still exists in Tulane's archives, marked Audio Number 11, Cane Field Site. At minute 0047, you hear Dr. Moore whisper, "It's the same rhythm." The song from 1937. God, it's still here. Her colleagues dismissed it as wind resonance. She disagreed. In her field notes, she wrote one line in red ink. The land remembers. Years passed. Her research went unpublished, her name nearly forgotten. But her students carried her fascination forward, among them a young African-American folklorist named James Holloway. In 1982, Holloway returned to the same site armed with better equipment, ground-penetrating radar audio sensors, and patience. What he found brought history and myth face to face. Beneath the soil less than a meter deep, his instruments detected irregular metal shapes clustered in a rough circle about 30 feet wide. The readings showed high carbon content consistent with burned iron. When the team excavated, they found remnants of shackles fused into blackened stone. But one shackle was different, broken cleanly at the center edges, melted smooth as glass. Stamped faintly near the curve of the cuff were 2 letters SC. Laboratory analysis showed it had been exposed to heat beyond what a standard fire could produce, temperatures upward of 2,000 degrees. The surrounding soil, too, had crystallized in patches, a geological phenomenon found usually in lightning strikes. But there were no lightning scars in that area, only the whisper of something unexplainable. Local newspapers picked up the story. Archaeologists find slave relics at lost plantation site. Most readers skimmed past it, another relic, another tragedy. But in the nearby black communities, the news spread like a heartbeat. Elders came forward telling stories their grandparents had whispered but never recorded. They spoke of the night when the sky turned red, when chains sang, when the man who refused to kneel walked free through the fire. One elder, Miss Loretta Vance, age 92, told Holloway, "He didn't die, baby. He just went where they couldn't follow." She said when she was a girl, her father would stop their wagon at that very field, tip his hat, and murmur, "Stand with me, old one." The discovery reignited curiosity. Historians revisited the old church songs, cross-referenced them with soldier diaries, even compared audio frequencies from Moore's tape with seismic readings. The results were inconclusive, but haunting. Every recording from that region carried the same background, hum steady, almost human always, the same rhythm. Engineers couldn't remove it. When filtered, the pattern resembled a heartbeat. 3 beats, a pause, a rise, the same rhythm that started in 1859, now pulsing through magnetic tape, through machines, through time itself. The climax of the investigation came in 1989, 130 years after Samuel Carter's last Defiance. Holloway's team, working under a research grant, set up overnight instruments at the site. Just after 1 a.m., the sensors triggered all at once. A vibration surged through the ground, lasting 8 seconds. Microphones captured what sounded like distant voices, layered, echoing, almost choral. No words distinguishable, only tone. Witnesses described a faint shimmer across the field, like heat rising from asphalt, though the air was cold. The lights of the nearby refinery flickered, and then silence. When Holloway replayed the tapes, he heard it not voices, but breath. Slow, deep, resolute. He titled the recording, "The Standing Pulse." Skeptics called it folklore, feeding on technology. Believers called it proof that the ancestors still speak. Either way, something was alive in that field. To this day, the audio file circulates quietly online. Some say if you listen long enough, volume low, eyes closed, you'll hear more than hums. You'll hear a voice, whispering the old vow, "I will not kneel." And maybe that's the bridge between past and present. Not science, not superstition, but resonance. A vibration that began with one man catching a whip in his hands and refusing to bow. Because what Samuel Carter started wasn't just defiance, it was frequency. A note of dignity that refuses decay. Fact Layer 2 gives us the evidence: burned metal-altered ledgers, recovered tapes, interviews that refuse to fade. Folklore. Layer 2 gives us meaning: the standing man, the hum, the legend that bends but doesn't break. Together they form a bridge, one built not from bricks or chains, but from sound memory and will. It's the bridge between what history writes and what the earth remembers. And when you stand there in that field at dusk, when the air begins to thicken, you understand what Dr. Moore meant. The past isn't gone. It's listening. There's a final twist. In 2009, during restoration of a historic courthouse near Convent, Louisiana, workers uncovered a hidden panel behind an old plaster wall. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box, a folded page, brittle but intact. The handwriting matched the overseer's journal from 1859. It read, "He looked at me and smiled. Said, 'I belong to no man.' Then the air cracked like thunder and all was light. Beneath that scrawled hastily one last line, the field sang. The same words found a century before, the same phrase that refused to die. Masituban. When archivists catalogued it, they filed it under unverified testimony. But maybe verification isn't the point. Maybe the point is that truth leaves traces, not always in ink, sometimes in vibration, in rhythm, in the soil itself. Some truths survive because they are believed. Others survive because they are felt. And in the story of the man who refused to kneel, it was always both. Because every generation that stands against oppression, every voice that hums when the world demands silence, adds another beat to that same rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, a rise. The rhythm of resistance, eternal, invisible, alive. The field is quiet now, but the silence isn't empty, it breathes. What began in 1859 as one man's refusal became something far larger than one plantation, one state, or even one century. It became a pulse that never stopped, a rhythm that outlived the chains that tried to hold it. Today, the Durrell land is gone, paved over by the slow creep of highways and warehouses. Yet if you stand at the levee's edge at dusk, the air still thick with that heavy Louisiana sweetness. You can feel it, the hum beneath the river, the faint echo beneath your feet, the land remembering. The descendants of St. James Parish still tell the story not from pulpits, not from books, but from memory. In family reunions and community gatherings, the elders lean forward, lowering their voices when they reach the part about the man who refused to kneel. They say he never died, that the fire took his body, but not his will. They say the hum in the fields is his breath, the steady exhale of a soul that never surrendered. Children listen with wide eyes, the way their grandparents once did when electricity hadn't yet replaced the stars. And when the old ones finish, there's always a pause, that same long breath before someone whispers, "He's still standing." It's easy in modern daylight to dismiss it as myth, a southern ghost story, a product of grief and memory. But myths like this don't survive by accident. They survive because they hold truth too raw to fade. In 2013, a young filmmaker from New Orleans, Alana Reese, returned to St. James Parish to document the descendants' oral histories. What she found wasn't just folklore, it was continuity. Every person she interviewed, from preachers to school teachers to teenagers, knew some version of the tale. Some called him the Standing Man. Others said Carter the Unbroken. A few spoke of him as if he were family. One woman, Mrs. Geneva Collins, smiled when asked what she believed. "Honey, belief ain't the question. He there, always been there. You stand in them fields long enough, you gon' stand too. That's what he left us, how to stand." That line became the title of Reese's documentary, How to Stand. Her film opens with a shot of the river, slow wide, the same Mississippi that once carried sugar and sorrow in equal measure. Her narration murmurs over the sound of water. He refused to kneel, and in doing so taught us how to rise. It won no awards, earned no headlines. But in black communities across the South, it spread quietly like the legend itself. Churches screened it after Sunday service. Teachers showed it in classrooms. In each viewing, when the final scene faded, the camera fixed on an empty field humming with cicadas, someone in the room began to hum. 3 beats, a pause, a rise. That hum has never stopped. Musicians have found it in the structure of spirituals, in the rhythm of blues, in the offbeat defiance of jazz, in the call and response of protest chants. Writers hear it in the cadence of speeches, in the poetry of survival. When marchers in Selma crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when protesters knelt during the anthem a century later, that same pulse was there, the rhythm of refusal. They may not know his name, but they moved to his echo. Because Samuel Carter was never just a man, he was the first note in an unfinished song. History tried to silence him with ledgers, with fire, with denial. Folklore kept him alive, in hums and songs, in the quiet courage of those who came after. And maybe that's the balance of all stories born from oppression history erases, memory rewrites. In that rewriting, defiance becomes inheritance. You can trace the lineage of that inheritance like a current from the fields of Louisiana to the gospel tents of Reconstruction, to the labor camps of World War I, to the steel cities of the Great Migration, to the marches of the 1960s, and beyond, into the digital hum of voices reclaiming truth today. It's the same sound, low, steady, unbroken, the hum of people who will not kneel. Some nights the modern world seems far away from that field. But when the storms roll in from the Gulf, thick, low, carrying thunder across the cane country, those who live nearby still say they hear him. Not as a ghost, not as fear, but as kin. A farmer once told a journalist, "I ain't never seen him. But when I plow, I leave one row untouched. That's his row. Always has been." He said it with no irony, no superstition, only respect. And maybe that's the truest monument, not statues, not museums, but gestures like that. A single untouched row of earth left for the man who refused to bow. No one knows where his bones lie. Maybe nowhere, maybe everywhere. But when the wind moves through the cane, it carries a shape, a whisper of motion, like someone walking slow, deliberate, upright. If you stand still, if you close your eyes, you can almost see him. Hands rough from labor, eyes clear as dawn, shoulders square against the horizon. He looks not at the past, but at the present, at us. And you realize something he must have known that night in 1859, that standing isn't about victory or vengeance. It's about memory, about dignity, about reminding the world what cannot be broken. Before we end, take a breath. Wherever you are, on a quiet road, on a city bus, in a room lit by a single screen, listen. Let the hum find you. Because the story you've just heard isn't about ghosts. It's about inheritance. And maybe in some way, you've carried that rhythm all along. So tonight, when the world feels heavy, when silence demands obedience, remember him. Remember the man who refused to kneel, and whisper his vow softly once more. I will not kneel. And before we close, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, what the air feels like where you stand. Tell me if you've ever heard that hum in the wind, in the street, or in your own chest. Because every time one voice remembers his story stands again, and the field somewhere out there in Louisiana hums a little louder.